لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا إنه من يهديه الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له من دون الله وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبد الله ورسوله وصفيه من خلقه وخليله أرسله ربه برحمة مهداة فهدانا به من بعد الضلالة وجمعنا به من بعد الشتات فجزاه الله عنا خير ما جزى نبيا عن أمته. أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وشر الأمور محدثاتها وما قل وكفى خير مما كثر وألهى. أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله تعالى فهي ميراث هذه الأمة أوصى بها الله سبحانه وتعالى نبيه فقال يا أيها النبي اتق الله، وأوصى بها الله سبحانه وتعالى عباده فقال يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته، وكانت هي الأمر للناس جميعا يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم إن زلزلة الساعة شيء عظيم. We begin as we always begin in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. All praise is indeed due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek His guidance, we seek His forgiveness, we seek refuge with Him from the evils of our souls and the sins that we have committed. Whomsoever Allah guides is indeed guided, whomsoever Allah leaves astray will find no other guide. We bear witness that there is no one worthy of worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His final prophet and His messenger. Indeed, the best of speech is the speech of Allah. The best of guidance is the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ. That which is little but suffices is better than that which is more but is a distraction. One of the challenges that I find myself in, and I feel many other people also find the same challenge, is living in the world in which we live, where there is so much evil that is happening around us, so much that is terrible that is happening around us, so much oppression, so much injustice, so much murder, and on scales that seem to really beg our understanding. We're not talking about a few hundred people or a few thousand people, but hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the world that are suffering a terrible degree of suffering. And the challenge for us becomes, what can we do about this? What can we do about the Rohingya? What can we do about the Uyghurs? What can we do for people in the Central African Republic? What can we do for people in Kashmir? What can we do for people in Gaza? And the list becomes overwhelming, and our inability becomes overwhelming. The fact that there is, or seemingly is, very little that we can do can be very difficult for us. And in the face of this overwhelming challenge and our inability, I think most of us give up. Most of us retreat into ourselves and feel that there is nothing that we can do. And that's what I want to talk about today. I don't claim to have an answer, but I want to share a story. And it's a story that I've always found inspiring, and I hope that, even though it does not provide a direct answer, that hearing the story together we derive some inspiration, some resolve from the example of other people who were in similar situations. And the story is the story of someone that many of us probably don't know. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but for most Muslims, we actually don't know the story. And it's the story of a man by the name of Abdullah. And he was born in the 18th century. 1712 is the best estimate. And he was born in a place far away, in what is present-day Indonesia, island, part of something called the Tidore Islands. And grew up as most young Muslims would grow up at that time. He learned the Quran, he learned Hadith, he learned basic Islamic knowledge, and then acquired some advanced Islamic knowledge because his father was a qadi. His father was a judge. So his name is Al-Amir Abdullah ibn Qadi Abdul Salam. And in the mid-1700s, the Netherlands, or back then they were called the Dutch, decided that they're going to go halfway around the world to try and take people's wealth. There were spices and rubber and other things. And so they sailed with these fleets. They were a very mighty naval power. And they ended up in Indonesia. They progressively occupied many of those islands. And they killed people. They subjugated who they could. And the idea was to take the natural wealth of the land. And naturally, as people should expect, there was resistance. People fought back. And as we can expect, because of the difference in preparedness, in technology at the time, in ability to fight, the native people lost. And so that part of the world, what is now Indonesia, fell under Dutch control. The Dutch were the victors. One of those struggles for justice, one of those struggles for a free homeland was led by Imam Abdullah. And he lost, and he was taken as prisoner. And the Dutch felt that he was too dangerous to keep where he was in his homeland. And so they sent him into exile, and they sent him into exile to another place where the Dutch had also subjugated and oppressed and occupied, and that was the colony of Cape Town in present-day South Africa. So he goes thousands of miles away from home. He's not free in Cape Town, he's actually in prison. He's imprisoned in an island that was built, or in which a prison was built specifically for people who are troublemakers, a place called Robben Island. And so he arrives, Amir Abdullah, Imam Abdullah ibn Qadi Abd Salam arrives on Robben Island in 1781. 180 years later, another man was to arrive also on Robben Island as a prisoner, Nelson Mandela, with Ahmed Kathrada, who was one of the Muslim man who was one of the original Ragona trialists. And that story, of course, we're more familiar with. But Abdullah arrives in the Cape Town, place that he does not know. He's a prisoner, and he is on his own. And from 1781 until about 1794, 13 years, he is kept in prison. And so here's the question. What does a man or a woman who is sent far away from their home to a place with which they are unfamiliar and put in prison by a power that is far superior, that is able to subjugate not only one part of the world but several, what does a person do? What can you do? What is it within your ability to actually do? And the decision that he makes is that he chooses to do what he can. Right? And so what he had at that point, the one thing that could not be taken away from him, was his knowledge. And so that is what he does. For those 13 years that he spends in prison, he sits there and he transcribes, writes out from memory everything that he knows about Islam. He writes out a nearly complete copy of the Quran from memory. He writes out all of the ahadith that he had memorized as a young person. He writes out a text of a fiqh book, another text of a aqidah book called Barahin, al-Barahin, written by a Maliki North African scholar that he had memorized. And he is doing this, if you remember the chronology, he was born in 1712, he arrives in Cape Town in 1780 or 81, he's 70 years old. Right? So he was 70 years old when he was fighting. He is 75 years in prison, and he has something that he can do, and he does it. When the first copy of the Quran arrived in South Africa, about 20 years after that, was a copy given to South African Muslims by the Ottoman Empire at the time. It came from Egypt. It was checked against the copy that Amir Abdullah, Imam Abdullah had written, and his copy, his transcription from memory was nearly perfect. And those copies, the copy of the Quran that he wrote out and transcribed in Robben Island, became the copy that South African Muslims depended on. Other copies were made from it, and some of those copies still exist today. Some of the families in South Africa, some Muslim families in South Africa, still have copies of that original transcription of the Quran that Abdullah wrote from memory. He collected this copy of the Quran with the Ahadith, with his book of Aqidah, with the book of Fiqh, and that became a compendium known as Ma'rifatul Islam, the knowledge of Islam. And when he was finally released from prison, now in his 80s, he would go home. He doesn't go home. The Cape had become his home. The vast majority of Muslims in the Cape were either slaves or people who were just freed. It was a very disparate community. Some were black, some were Malay, like him, who had been exiled from the Malay Islands. And so what he does is he establishes a madrasa. And then years later, in 1804, shortly before he dies, he's able to establish a masjid, appropriately enough named as Al-Masjid Al-Awwal. And then he died shortly after that in 1806. The madrasa teaches everyone, children, women, slaves, freedmen, anyone who's interested in learning about Islam, anyone who wants to learn about Islam. And the spread of Islam in South Africa is credited back to that first madrasa that was established by Imam Abdullah. There's more that we can say about what he did and the impact that he's had on subsequent generations, but suffice it to say that in the 1960s, 150 years later, 160 years later, when Muslims were trying to find their footing in the struggle for equality, his example was being cited. The values for which he stood, for which he fought, for which he taught, and which he passed on to other people, were some of the values that the Muslims in Cape Town and in South Africa appealed to when they were fighting against apartheid with their black countrymen. But he is an example of, and that's the point that I want to make, he's an example of someone who doesn't know whether what they are doing will ever bear fruit. He could not know when he was sitting there in his cell on Robben Island in the late 1700s, he couldn't know that he would survive to be able to teach any of this. He couldn't know that what he was writing out itself would survive independently of him. But it is what he could do. He had that knowledge, he could do this, and so he did it. Now, in a previous part of his life, he did something else. He fought, right? Because at that point in time, that was what was required. That was something that he could do, and so he did it. And so, what I want to take away from the story of Imam Abdullah, as he became known, Tuan Guru, or esteemed master or teacher, the story of Tuan Guru is about these two things. It's about going about our lives, figuring out what is it that we can do, but also understanding what is it that is needed. And to the extent that we can put those two things together, that there is something that is needed in this world, and I have an aptitude or an ability for it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me the skill to be able to do it, that becomes my obligation. My obligation is not to succeed. My obligation is not to make sure that this ends up doing something. My obligation is to fulfill the part of my responsibility of learning, acquiring a skill, understanding the world around me, and trying to apply what I know and my skills to the world in which we live. And so we are not going to be able to, this community, us as individuals, we will not save the Rohingya. We will not save the Uyghurs. We will not, on our own. We will make very little impact on what is happening in Gaza. But that does not mean that there is nothing that we can do. Collectively, there is much that we can do, but individually, we also have a responsibility. And so, I can't answer the question from here for each one of us. I could barely answer the question for myself. What am I good at? What do I need to do? What can I do? But that introspection, that waqfa ma'a nafs, stopping to ask ourselves this question of what can I do in the world is an individual obligation. And so that's what I want to actually leave with all of us today, is that today, on this Friday, on this blessed day of Jum'ah, that we individually resolve to spend a bit of time, at least, with ourselves and ask ourselves this question: what can I do? What can I do in the world? And if I can't do it right now with what I have, how do I change myself? How do I train myself? How do I acquire a skill in order to be able to do that in the world? And it does not have to be big. It just has to be the best that we can do. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, when we talk about Imam Abdullah sitting down in Robben Island and writing this compendium of Ma'rifatul Islam and going out after 13 years of being in prison and teaching it, and that period of time was a period of mass conversions to Islam because of that effort. When he sat down and picked up that pen and put that ink to paper and wrote that first ba in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in Surah Al-Fatiha, he could not possibly know what this will lead to. He could not possibly imagine where this work will end. When he started it, he may have had a lot of hope, a lot of tawakkul, a lot of conviction in the power and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he could not know. And so when we start something today, however small it may be, we don't know where it can end with the blessing and the tawfiq and the barakah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is up to us is this: what can I do? What can I do well? What do I need to do to make that contribution in the world? أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لكم واستغفروه. Bismillah alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa amma ba'd. I want to just focus on one small piece before we close, and that is the issue of scholarship and knowledge. It is impossible to ignore the fact that what Imam Abdullah did was in large part because he was a scholar. He was not a man of average knowledge, although memorizing the Quran and memorizing a number of ahadith and a matn or a text of books of fiqh and aqidah at that time was not very unusual. But he was a scholar, he was a man of knowledge, and that is why he was able to actually teach this once he was released from prison and so on. And there is this seduction, if you like, there's this gravitation that we have towards the idea of doing something means that I study. I sit in a halaqa, I take a dars, take a course, and so on and so forth. And I just want to say something briefly about this. There is no doubt that knowledge is valuable, and that when we embark on a course of action, we need to understand. We need to understand it. We need to understand the world. We need to understand how to do things. من عمل بغير علم كان يفسد أكثر مما يصلح. That if you try to do things without really understanding what you're doing, you will do more harm than good. But we have to distinguish and understand the difference between the the minimum required knowledge that we all need and between additional knowledge that is specialized for certain circumstances. There is a certain amount of knowledge that we must all acquire, both about Islam and about the world, both about our deen and about how to practice that deen in the world in which we live. When we talk about practicing our deen and that basic knowledge, it is essential in today's world that we have that basic knowledge. It is essential that we understand the Quran, at least in its, as a whole, that we understand the basics of fiqh, that we understand the basics of how fiqh was derived, that we understand the basics of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and so on. These things, if we do not acquire, then it becomes a problem. We become a problem. قيل تعلموا العلم وإن لم تنالوا به حظا فلأن يذم لكم الزمان خير من أن يذم بكم. That we need to acquire knowledge, even if it's a basic minimum amount of knowledge, even if we're not going to teach it. For people, to say to us the world is a terrible place is far better than we becoming the cause of the world being a terrible place because of our ignorance. Knowledge is important, but it is a basic amount of knowledge that we're all obligated to have, and beyond that, it is for a few people to try and pursue more advanced knowledge. Along with that, the knowledge of how we apply our deen in the world is also essential. عباد الله اعلموا أن الله أمركم بأمر عظيم بدأ به بنفسه وثنى به على ملائكة عرشه واختتمه بكم أيها المؤمنون حيث قال عز من قائل إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما باركت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. عباد الله اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم ارفع مقتك وغضبك عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما فعل السفهاء منا ولا تسلط علينا بذنوبنا من لا يخافك ولا يرحمنا. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا كريم. اللهم لا تدع لنا في يومنا هذا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا عيبا إلا سترته ولا دينا إلا قضيته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا غائبا إلا سالما غانما إلى أهله رددته ولا حاجة من حوائج الدنيا لك فيها رضا ولنا فيها صلاح إلا قضيتها ويسرتها يا أرحم الراحمين. عباد الله اعلموا أن الله أمركم بثلاث ونهاكم عن ثلاث أمركم بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى ونهاكم عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله يذكركم. Remember Allah, He will remember you. واشكروه يزدكم. Thank Him, He will give you forevermore. واستغفروه يغفر لكم. Seek His forgiveness, He will surely grant it to you. وأقم الصلاة.